Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to Dupont Summit 2024. Our next session is delivered by Dr. Page. Dr. Page is a disease ecologist and climate scientist currently working in Laboratory of Disease Ecology and Biogeography at Virginia Tech with Dr. Luis Escobar. Let's welcome Dr. Page.
Thank you all so much. Please just allow me to share my screen really quickly. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Again, my name is Dr. Paige Vandeverst, and I am currently a graduate researcher at Virginia Tech in the Laboratory of Disease Ecology and Biogeography under the tutelage of Dr. Luis Escobar. My pronouns are she, her, and I just finished defending my dissertation yesterday. I keep having to remind myself that I do have the PhD now. I am currently in the Translational Biology, Medicine, and Health program, which is an interdisciplinary graduate education program at Virginia Tech. And I have been working with Dr. Luis Escobar, who is a very well-known disease ecologist and biogeographer, where we study the impacts of global change and other disturbances on disease ecology. So my research is very much focused on spillover or zoonotic spillover systems, where we have pathogens that exist inside of some species, such as wildlife or even livestock, that can then spill over or be transmitted into new species. And this can also include humans. Now, we know that zoonotic spillover is something that you've probably heard about recently, especially within the context of something like COVID or other emerging infectious diseases. And zoonotic spillover has resulted in many pathogens of high consequence recently that have led to virulent outbreaks or even pandemics. I also seek to understand how changes to the planet, so things related to global change, such as climate change, landscape degradation, or changes to land or sea productivity, impact zoonotic spillover paradigms. So my work can be considered to be part of the One Health paradigm, which is a method of assessing and optimizing health that focuses on this interconnection between humans, animals, plants, and their shared environment. So oftentimes when we see poor ecosystem health, we'll see that manifest itself in poor health outcomes for different animal species, and then that starts to spill over into human populations. We also have these global level factors such as climate change or natural disasters that can impact the health of environments, animals, and people all at the same time. Now, my research is also very much focused on bat-borne systems. So the bat that you're seeing at the bottom right of your screen is called Desmodus rotundus. It's otherwise known as the common vampire bat. And they are a known reservoir of the rabies virus. They can transmit rabies fairly effectively to many different species. So my work has focused on how environmental variation and climate change impacts the distribution of this bat species and the rabies it can transmit. Now, many of us are familiar with climate change, but just as a primer, climate change refers to the overall increase in global average temperatures across time from pre-industrial levels and the associated changes to the climate that global average increase incurs. So global warming is this increase of temperatures. Climate change refers to the vast degree of variability that can arise from that change. So climate change can result in higher temperatures, but it can also result in other impacts as well, such as more severe weather patterns, greater air pollution, water quality impacts, or food and water supply impacts. And these can arise from things like sea level rise, more extreme weather patterns, or rising temperatures associated with these increases in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Now, something else that we know about climate change is that it's a very large and global issue, and it can impact human health in many different ways. Those water quality impacts that are associated with rising sea levels can lead to increases in things like cholera or cryptosporidium. We can also see disruption to food and water supply systems that can lead to malnutrition or diarrheal diseases. So the way that climate change impacts the planet impacts our health. We know that the life cycles and propagation of many pathogens, and a pathogen is something that causes diseases, so something like a virus or a bacteria or even a fungus, and climate can very much impact where those pathogens come from and how frequently they reproduce. We also know that climate change can impact the ecology of hosts and pathogens. So when I talk about hosts, I'm talking about organisms that can carry a pathogen or even transmit it. So these can be natural reservoirs or even vectors, and these can be many, many different species that all interconnect and interact with one another across the very complex ecosystems that we have across the Earth. We also know that host distributions can be altered by climate change. So, where and when different species live across landscapes can be changed due to changes in the climate. So, if an area becomes too hot across the year to support a specific species, they might move north or south of that current distribution, or they might move up in elevation to cooler areas that are more hospitable to them. And so many of these factors that climate change impacts can act across scale. We have these individual level factors that can be impacted, up to regional level factors, and even up to global level things like land cover change, species ranges, and pollution. Now, something that we're seeing with regard to climate change impacts to health is an increase in range expansions for different species that can act as vectors or reservoirs. So an example of this would be something like the common vampire bat, where we have seen this bat extend its range north through Mexico towards the United States as climates have shifted across the last 100 years. We've also seen in the last 50 years a concurrent increase in the number of outbreaks of rabies that we're seeing in cattle that are associated with this bat. Now, vampire bats are a blood-feeding species. This means that their saliva has to come into contact with the blood of the animals that they feed upon, and this makes them very effective transmitters of the rabies virus. So again, as that vampire bat has extended its range north, we've seen this increase in outbreaks associated with that range shift. And if climatic trends continue, we could see this bat extend its range as far north as the United States. We have also seen something called an increase in vector capacity. Now, a vector is generally an arthropod, like a mosquito or a tick, that can transmit a pathogen from one individual to another. So oftentimes we think about mosquitoes within the context of things like malaria, dengue, or even yellow fever. And we've seen vector capacity, or their ability to transmit pathogens, or how frequently they're biting different individuals, increase with this change in climate or increase in climate and in temperature in some locations. Two vectors that we know have been impacted in almost all geographic areas include Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus, which are two key vectors of different pathogens that very much impact a lot of different human populations. We're also seeing climate change increase suitable area for certain pathogens. So what I mean that is we know that different pathogens can exist in different locations depending on the suitability of that location for the pathogen. If it's too warm or too cold for that pathogen's tolerance, it's unlikely to exist in that area. An example of this would be something like cholera, which we know can cause pretty intense sickness in humans. And if we look at current climates, you can see those areas of red on the map on the left where we have high suitability for the species in terms of climate. However, if we project that model into the future under different climate change scenarios or extrapolate that model, you can see how the areas that are suitable for cholera have drastically increased as climates have gotten warmer and that pathogen has more area where it can reproduce and live. So again, these increases not just in vector capacity or distribution, but in the total suitable area for them as well. So when seeking to understand how climate change might impact infectious diseases or public health, we also have to look at where public health is most impacted by current conditions and where the burden of infectious diseases is most ardently felt. So this is a map of global burden of infectious disease, and you can see that many areas that have a high burden of infectious disease are in tropical or subtropical ecosystems. Many countries that are developing or considered low income also have a heavy associated burden of infectious diseases, as well as many areas that we know are going to be impacted by climate change. We also know that many of the factors that are present in the locations where we have a high burden of infectious disease can lead to the reemergence or even emergence of new pathogens. So things like the wildlife trade, human migration, poverty or social inequality, urbanization at an accelerated rate, and elevated antimicrobial resistance due to antibiotic use all of these factors are generally present in these same areas as well. So infectious disease risk kind of compounds with many of the social issues that we see present in some of these areas. We also know that climate change risks can often compound on top of locations that are already at heavy risk for infectious disease burden. So this is a map of physical climate change impacts, and you can see some of the locations that are in dark red on this map were also in dark red on the previous map. So not just an associated burden of climate change, but also a heavy associated burden of infectious disease risk. So what we wanted to do in my lab was do an assessment of what current literature says about infectious diseases and climate change. We wanted to understand what research questions had been asked, what the current trends in research were, and how we could collate or summarize our data and hopefully give us a way forward in order to understand the current impacts of climate change on infectious disease. And this is what I want to present to you today is kind of the summary of where we're at scientifically. And this paper was recently published in Infectious Diseases of Poverty. And this is what we call a scoping review that was published back in 2023. So the way that we did this was we collected every piece of scientific literature we could possibly get our hands on from the years 2015 to 2020. Now we did this in 2021. So this literature review encompasses about 5 years. As we are approaching the year 2025, we do want to do this study again. So this is kind of a snapshot of the most recent 5-year period of literature that we have. Our initial search gained us over 10,000 publications that used the keywords of climate change and infectious disease. So there's an abundance of research on this topic. We collected these data from things like university libraries, Web of Science, PubMed, and Clairvoyant or Clairvot Analytics. And then we did an initial filtering of all of this research to see what the trends were here. After an initial filtering, we found that only 621 of this initial 10,000 pieces of literature was actually doing a quantitative assessment of climate change impacts to infectious diseases. So what this tells us is that there's a lot of literature out there that uses the keyword of climate change or infectious disease that does not necessarily assess that change across time. So of these 621 papers that we wound up assessing, we did a secondary screening with at least 4 researchers to get kind of a consensus of what we were seeing in each paper, extracted data from these papers and collated and assessed them for different patterns of research trends. And what we identified was that about 60% of the papers that assessed climate change and infectious diseases from 2015 to 2020 reported that climate change was having an impact on the disease system being assessed. Only about 8% of those papers reported that there was no impact of climate on the infectious disease. Something else that we found interesting was that about 33% of these papers reported that there was a possible or potential impact of climate change on the disease system, but that they could not say one way or the other if that was identifiable or not. Of that 60% of papers that identified that climate change was having an impact, 81% of them found that climate change was increasing the burden of the associated pathogen. So of research that assesses climate change impacts, most of them identify that climate change is going to augment infectious diseases, and 81% of those papers find that it's going to increase the burden of that pathogen. About 11% of the papers identified that climate change was actually going to decrease the burden of the infectious disease. Now, this means that areas could become too hot for a certain pathogen to exist, or we might not have this associated burden because of the changes to the climate. And again, that 8% found no impact. So what this tells us is that many of the infectious diseases that we currently know heavily impact human populations could be exacerbated by climate change based on this assessment. We also wanted to assess where research was being conducted so that we could get a better understanding of kind of socioeconomic and societal distribution of research. And what we identified was that many of the countries that had a lot of studies occurring in them also had high human population densities. So we decided to correct for population and identify research effort per capita for each country. And what we identified here was that there was a really interesting latitudinal and socioeconomic trend where countries that are further away from the equator, countries that are a little bit more well-developed, and countries with temperate climates had higher research effort per capita. So you can see those darker countries on this map, such as Canada, Finland, and Australia, have more research devoted to them than other locations. Now, this is somewhat concerning because we know that many emerging infectious diseases of high consequence, such as some of the ones that you're seeing on the screen, have originated in locations that were not as heavily studied. So if we look at maps of zoonotic spillover risk or even viral sharing risk associated with climate change, you'll see that many of those hotspots are in locations antithetical to where we were seeing most of our research. So not that much zoonotic spillover risk or viral sharing is present in Canada, but that country had some of the highest research effort per capita within the context of climate change and infectious disease. So there could be some kind of geographic bias here. We also wanted to assess what taxonomic groups or what animal groups were being most studied. And we found that arthropods, so things like insects, and humans were the most well-studied animal groups. Now, this is understandable because human health is often the driving factor behind most research. But some of these other groups that we know are more heavily impacted by climate change, such as birds or amphibians, were not as well studied as we had anticipated. We also wanted to look at the transmission types of different pathogens that were being assessed. So are we looking at an emphasis on upper respiratory infections or other types of diseases? And we found that most research during this period was devoted towards vector-borne diseases and food and waterborne pathogens. Other kind of transmission types, such as directly transmitted diseases, such as those transmitted through fomites or fecal oral transmission or environmental exposure, were not as well assessed during this period. And of those specific diseases studied, there were over 200 individual pathogens studied during this period. This is just the top 20 or so. And again, it was reflective of that emphasis on vector-borne diseases. So things like malaria, dengue, and Lyme disease were very heavily studied during this period. Other pathogens less so. And when we looked at our individual vectors assessed, very much there was a focus on mosquito-borne pathogens. So why exactly was there such an emphasis on vector-borne diseases during this 2015 to 2020 period? Well, we know that vector-borne diseases have a very heavy impact, especially in certain areas such as sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia. 3 out of every 4 malaria deaths are children. Vector-borne diseases are the 4th leading cause of death for children under the age of 5. And we also know that vector-borne diseases have heavy associated economic impacts. We can also draw pretty clear links between vector propagation or vector capacity and changes in climate. It's pretty easy to understand how something like a variation in temperature might impact an arthropod, especially because we can do many of these controlled studies in laboratories. It's very easy to take arthropods into the lab and do these kind of focused temperature change or precipitation change assessments on these vectors. However, more anatomically complex vectors such as bats or birds are a little bit more difficult to study, especially in a laboratory context. Something we did want to note, though, was that we know that upper respiratory infections are more impactful for certain populations, especially pediatrics. I work a lot with the World Society of Pediatric Infectious Diseases, so there's a pretty heavy concern for upper respiratory infections. However, these types of infections were not as well assessed during this period. We also wanted to see who was doing research during this period, and overwhelmingly, research was conducted by higher education institutions such as colleges or universities, followed by governmental bodies. Independent research organizations or individuals were less well published during this period. And funding for studies conducted in the year 2020 specifically was overwhelmingly funded by federal institutions or governing bodies, or some combination of federal or government funding and other funding sources, followed by non-governmental organizations or local agencies. The institutions that were published most frequently during this period were pretty reflective of where research was being conducted. So this map here shows you the numbers of number of studies that were affiliated with the lead authors of the institutions. So most research was published by individuals that were from the United States. Other leading countries and organizations include Beijing Normal University, Australia, UC Berkeley, those kinds of institutions, which are shown here in blue dots. So a lot of overlap between where research was conducted and who was publishing that research. So what were our kind of key takeaways from this assessment, and what did we want to note for the overall assessment of climate change and infectious diseases? Well, principally, there was a geographic bias where more research was occurring in temperate, well-developed areas, as well as a subject and taxonomic bias with more research devoted towards mammals and arthropods than other taxonomic groups. Which again is somewhat understandable because human health is such a driving force behind research efforts. But we did note that we might be leaving out some of those key reservoirs or vectors that might not be as well understood during this period. And some neglected areas included developing countries or low-income countries, as well as tropical areas. We also noted that there were some specific disease systems that were neglected during this period, including parasitic infections, directly transmitted pathogens, wildlife diseases, and upper respiratory infections. And that's concerning because many, again, of the pathogens of high consequence that we've seen recently have been these types of infections. One massive caveat for this assessment is that it was research that was conducted primarily before the COVID-19 pandemic. So the onset of the novel coronavirus 2 pathogen in late 2019 very much is going to shape the landscape distribution of research, especially within the context of climate change. So we expect that the focus of research in that 2020 to 2025 research period, that would be the next 5 years of research, is very much going to change due to the onset and impact of this pandemic. So what are exactly some recommendations that we would bring from this research? Well, we would call for an increase in collaboration, especially with underrepresented countries. Many of the locations that we identified as being underserved or understudied are locations where we know infectious disease burden is high and where we know zoonotic spillover risk is elevated. So if we were to increase some collaboration there between countries that have the infrastructure to do some of these studies, it might allow us to elucidate some of these really important factors, especially in the context of infectious diseases. And potentially a more ecological model of health study might aid us in, again, assessing some of those reservoirs and vector species that were less well understood during this period. And with that, I'd like to thank our funding institutions, including the National Institute of Health and the National Science Foundation, as well as our collaborating institutions at Virginia Tech, as well as my co-author, Dr. Luis Escobar, and all of our undergraduate researchers in the Laboratory of Disease Ecology and Biogeography. If you are interested in this research or reading more depth into our findings, you can find these papers published in a few different journals, and those are shown here on the screen, including Ecography, Infectious Diseases of Poverty, as well as Frontiers of Earth Science. And with that, I will take any questions that you have.
Thank you, Paige. There are actually 2 questions from Lana. The first one is, are there any examples of successful interventions or strategies that have mitigated climate-related disease outbreaks?
Effective strategies to mitigate infectious disease burden from climate change?
Climate-related disease.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I think the issue here is that oftentimes we focus on mitigation and not adaptation. So adapting to the current situation where we're seeing these elevated increases we're seeing associated increases of disease burden is more of an adaptation question, and then I think it is a mitigation question. I'm not thinking of any situation off the top of my head where we have successfully prevented an infectious disease associated with climate change from impacting a population. There's plenty of examples of infectious diseases of high consequence that have been successfully mitigated due to large investment from the international community. A great example of that would be something like Zaire Ebola virus, where we were projecting a lot of mortality because that pathogen was so virulent. But at the end of the day, because of the heavy investment by the international community, there was only about 15,000 deaths versus the hundreds of thousands that some people were forecasting. So I think it's definitely possible to mitigate the impact of an infectious disease, but oftentimes we don't know that that infectious disease has been augmented by climate change until all of that data has been processed.
Sounds great. And the second question from Lana, how can climate adaptation strategies integrate disease prevention measures effectively?
That's a great question. So many climate adaptation strategies have co-benefits of disease prevention. So many of the factors that we utilize in the agricultural space, such as agroforestry or nature-based solutions for agriculture, also have a co-benefit of improving animal health and associated ecosystem health. So if we can keep those negative health impacts that we see in the ecosystem and the environment from impacting both wildlife and domesticated species, we can see that co-benefit of those climate adaptation strategies. So that it's kind of a roundabout way of looking at it, but through that One Health lens, those climate adaptation strategies that we know improve health of ecosystems can also impact public health infrastructure.
Sounds great. I don't see any new questions popping up, so I think that's it. Do you want to wrap up your presentation?
Yeah, that's fine. I think that's all I've got. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to shoot me an email. My email is pvandeverst@vt.edu. And thank you so much for giving me your time today.
Thank you. To our next session will begin at 2:35 and see you later. Bye bye. Have a great weekend.